Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Henry Trembath. I'm a senior from Denver, Colorado, and I'm a government major. Tonight, we got a real good talk for all of you who way too in the weeds on the technical talk of tariffs, or for those of you who don't even really know what they are, this session will be for you. Tonight, we welcome to In the News, Mr. Greg Ip, the chief economics commentator from the Wall Street Journal. He'll talk with us tonight about Trump, trade, and tariffs. He is a Canadian-American from Canada. He earned his bachelor's in economics and journalism at Carleton University before starting his distinguished career in journalism and as an author. His first job was as a reporter at the Vancouver Sun, where he focused on financing before moving to the United States, working with the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, before returning to the Wall Street Journal, where he now focuses on the US, global economies, and economic policy. So tonight he'll talk with us maybe some of the strategy behind Trump's trade policy, what it means for Americans, and what it means for the world, too. This event is co-sponsored by the economics department, so we have economics Professor Walkirch, and then we also have our student co-moderator, Anaviv Khanna, class of 27. Thank you, guys, and I hope we have a great conversation.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you all for being here and joining us in this conversation about what's going on in Washington. How can we make sense of the economic policy news that we see coming out of Washington these days? And of course, a special thanks to Greg Ip from the Wall Street Journal for joining us this evening. I want to jump right in, and I'd like us to start off sort of with the bigger picture. So what I really want to know is, how did we get to the current state of affairs where all of a sudden globalization is questioned on multiple fronts, where high and nearly indiscriminate tariffs are on the table. They threaten to severely curb international commerce. So maybe, Greg, you could start us off by talking a little bit about what was the consensus after World War II in terms of trade and the international economic order, and how has that changed recently, and especially how or why are we seeing such a fundamental change in very recent years?
Sure, Andreas, and thank you very much for having me here this evening. It's an honor to be addressing all of you, and hopefully I have a few interesting things to have for you, and I'm looking forward to a longer conversation later on. So I think to understand why we are where we are, it helps to understand how we got here. You go back to the 1930s and the Great Depression. I think that was a period of high protectionism, beginning with the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930. And when world leaders got together in the ashes of the world after the end of World War II, they believed that one of the ways to prevent another international conflagration wasn't just political cooperation, but economic cooperation. And so they created economic institutions that were intended to keep barriers down and keep countries trading with each other and transacting with each other. And one of those institutions was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was essentially international consensus among developed markets to begin lowering tariff barriers among each other. And in successive rounds over the next few decades, they did lower tariff barriers, and they lowered some non-tariff barriers, things like quotas and so forth. And the country that was the primary driver of this move to liberalization was the United States. It had come out of World War II as the largest economy in the world by far, the one that had been least damaged by the war. And leaders of the United States at the time, people like Harry Truman, the president, and John Foster Dulles and others, sort of saw the integration of trade as integral to the United States' mission of keeping the world safe for America geopolitically as well. The theory being that if other countries were sort of like got rich and saw that their getting rich was related to trading with the United States, it would be a peaceful world for the United States. And so the United States was willing to, in some sense, see the synergy between the military umbrella and its securities interests with the international economic context, making the world safe for free trade and for capitalism and so forth. So the United States was willing to lower its trade barriers as a way of inducing reciprocity from other countries, a practice that had begun under Cordell Hull in the 1930s and continued through to the 1940s. So you make your way to the 1970s, and this was the period, in some sense, the golden age of globalization, a period that was more or less underwritten by the United States, which for most of that period was the free world's unquestioned economic military superpower. Well, what happens in the 70s and the 80s? Well, first of all, our former adversaries, Germany and Japan, have caught up with us. They're just as rich as us. And in the process, they've developed very large trade surpluses with the United States. And this begins to create protectionist pressures in the United States. Ronald Reagan comes along in the 1980s, imposes voluntary export restraints and other forms of protectionism to try and rebalance things in recognition that Americans are beginning to think that this deal is not working out so well for them. In the 1990s, the Soviet Union collapses. The United States once again emerges as a world superpower, once again begins to see economic openness as integral to its mission of making the world a peaceful place for the American concept of liberal democracy. And in 2000, admits China to the World Trade Organization, a process that gives China effectively enormous access to Western markets in the US in particular. But the explosion of imports into the United States that follows China's accession to the WTO displaces millions of people. And I think also for the first time, Americans begin to appreciate, or American leaders begin to appreciate, that free trade and capitalism do not automatically make a country democratic and friendly towards the United States. As China grew rich, it became more adversarial towards the United States. That brings us to the year 2016. At this point, even among people like the Barack Obama administration, this rethink of China and trade had already been underway. But Donald Trump is elected, and he brings a completely different point of view where he believes very strongly that the United States has been a loser from its embrace of openness, whether it's for immigration and trade. And he embraces the idea that a return to tariffs is a way to put the United States back on top of the world. And it gets a very open message, and that message is welcomed by many Americans who are disillusioned with the way the country has gone, whether it's because economic growth has slowed down, wages for non-college educated people have stopped growing very much, or the character of their communities and the demographic makeup of the country is changing rapidly because of immigration. And so that, in some sense, I believe, gives you the context of why we ended up where we are. It's not so much is that Trump invented the new view of make America great again via tariffs. He, in some sense, entered a world that was primed to hear that message.
It seems to me that when we look at back at Trump's first term, he started off very, very slowly, right? So he took some time, went through the usual channels, investigating what is going on with China. Should we impose tariffs? How should we impose tariffs? How high should they be? And it was sort of a fairly normal, deliberate process, and it took until 2018 for tariffs to really get implemented in a fairly select fashion, in a somewhat orderly fashion. So that seems to be the beginning of change in the trade policy, but it seems now we're barely, 2 months into the new administration, that things are moving much, much more rapidly. So are there additional things that you see that have happened in the meantime, which explain why this tariff fetishism, if you want, has accelerated?
You're absolutely right, Andreas, and I think that's a very important observation, that the Trump second term is very different in character from Trump's first term. And one of the reasons why is that when Trump came in, he certainly had his very deeply held beliefs that tariffs are wonderful and trade deficits are terrible, views, by the way, that almost no economists shared or very many other political leaders at the time. But nonetheless, he had those views, but he was surrounded by people who didn't share those views. Many of people on his first term economic staff, people like Gary Cohen, who is his National Economic Council director, were very much establishment. They grew up in a world where essentially the spread of free trade agreements, things like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, were seen as very much in the interest of the United States for both economic and geopolitical purposes. Congress, the Republican caucus in Congress was still very much a traditional Republican caucus that thought tariffs were taxes, and once again, generally supported trade liberalization. And so operating in that context, Trump did not feel empowered to really sort of shock the system and perhaps indulge the instincts that he felt most strongly. Even the person who was in some sense the architect of his first term trade agenda, Robert Lighthizer, his trade ambassador, was a Reagan Republican who thought of Reagan as a person who was fundamentally for, security alliances, for open markets, but not wedded to free trade in a doctrinaire way. And so it was Lighthizer who basically, found existing statutes and found ways to use those to act against China, act to protect steel and aluminum, But if you look carefully, this looked a lot like Ronald Reagan. It didn't look like something radically different. And when it came to NAFTA, it was Lighthizer who led the way in renegotiating that agreement to address what he thought were weaknesses in the original agreement, but fundamentally to create a framework where the U.S. still traded and still fundamentally wanted to be open, provided it believed that the countries it was trading with were open to it. Now you come to the second, and by the way, we haven't talked much about Biden, but Biden, in some sense, kept the framework that Trump left from his first term. Did not really remove many of those tariffs, did not really warm up to the World Trade Organization, kept that sort of like slightly more protectionist color to US trade policy. Trump comes in the second term. It's a very, very different cast. First of all, it's clear that no longer is he bringing people around him who are intended to advise him and to change his mind. Rather, they are intended to listen to him and then to be spokespeople or enablers of how he sees the world. The Congress has changed. A lot of the people who are more inclined towards free trade have retired or left, or the people who disagreed with Trump, they lost primaries. And so you now have a Republican caucus that is much more loyal to Trump in the way he sees the world. And he's surrounded himself with people like J.D. Vance, who come from what we call the new right, who have a much more sort of like a view of conservative politics that is much more culturally rather than economically based. And so Trump feeling much more in charge of his own administration, much more the leader of his own party, and in some sense less constrained by things like the need to run again, feels able to indulge his deepest held beliefs. And that's why you've seen him move very rapidly, not waiting after a year or two of examination and investigation, but moving rapidly to impose very high tariffs on Canada and Mexico, effectively neutering the free trade pact he himself negotiated in 2018. And on April 2nd, yeah, sorry, go ahead. To finish up, and on April 2nd, possibly bringing forth this reciprocal trade plan, which would be even more disruptive to the existing order.
Yeah, I was going to pick up exactly on that, right? That in his first term, he said, well, the NAFTA was a terrible agreement. We're going to renegotiate it. They did. Arguably, it doesn't look all that different from the original NAFTA, but we give it a new name and a new shine, and that's fine. So I think people are particularly surprised that the first two countries that he's going after are Mexico and Canada, supposedly friendly countries, especially Canada. We've always had a great relationship with them. So why go after them first and not more after China? I mean, he's done a little bit of that, but not nearly as much, or even other countries around the world that are far less friendly to the United States.
It's a fascinating question, and I'm not sure that we have a clear answer because, indeed, Trump is a person who basically, tweets from the hip, as it were, and essentially makes policy on the go. And you're often in a situation, and we in the media are in this situation, of listening to his staff trying to basically explain after the fact what it is that Trump wants. So when he imposed the tariffs on China, China, Canada, and Mexico, the stated reason was he wants their cooperation in reducing the inflow of illegal migrants and fentanyl into the United States. But subsequent to that, he's stated all sorts of motives for those tariffs. Leading one is he just wants to get rid of the trade deficit with Canada and Mexico. He basically wants all cars that the United States buys to be made in the United States. He doesn't want them imported any longer from assembly plants in Canada and Mexico. In the case of Canada, he has said that he wants Canada to become part of the United States. He calls it a 51st state. And so this, I think, speaks to a couple of things. First of all, the fact that Trump likes tariffs, beginning, middle, end of story. And the motive or the explanation that he sometimes advances for the tariffs is in some sense secondary to the fact that he does want to raise tariffs. Also, he sees value in tariffs in and of themselves. He thinks they're a source of revenue and that maybe they enable him to reduce other kinds of taxes like income taxes. Now, there's a long conversation about whether that's actually an efficient way to change our tax system, but it's part of his thinking. He wants permanently higher tariffs as a way of rethinking the entire income tax system. But he's a believer that tariffs are kind of like the Swiss Army knife of economic policies, that you can use them to basically stop drug trafficking. You can use them to make countries like Colombia accept deported migrants. You can use them to get Russia or Ukraine or whoever to cooperate on a desired peace deal. And maybe you can use it to force Canada to submit to annexation, although right now the Canadians don't seem to be interested in that.
We wouldn't think so, right? So that begs sort of two questions. One is clearly we have seen this before. We can go all the way back to the 1930s to Smoot-Hawley, which you mentioned earlier on. We can go back to the first term when tariffs were imposed. And already now we see that our trading partners that are hit by tariffs are not taking them lying down, right? That they're looking for ways to retaliate. So do you think that he's completely unconcerned with the damage that retaliation is doing?
I don't think he's completely unconcerned, but he's a lot less concerned about it than he was perhaps in his first term, and then many other people are. Part of his thinking, and this is a view that's wide held among him and his other pro-tariff advisors, is that because the United States on average imports twice as much as it exports, that there's an asymmetry in the effect of tariffs, is that our trading partners suffer more when we put tariffs on them than when they put tariffs on us. And Trump has also said that if a country retaliates, he will double the tariffs. In other words, he is quite willing to get into a tit-for-tat cycle of escalation, believing that the United States can endure such a test longer than the other side. This is one of those things where you get into sort of like game theory, and it's very difficult to know exactly where it ends or who has the upper end. But I would say that, in trade war as an actual war, the other side gets a vote, and that there are complex dynamics that go on, and it's not always the case that the other side will respond based purely on its economic or financial interest, which is sometimes the way Trump frames these arguments. So Canada, for example, is in the middle of is probably about to enter an election campaign, and that creates a political dynamic that makes it difficult for its leaders not to retaliate. The European Union, similarly, as a very large trading partner of the United States, doesn't believe that the United States is right to be doing this, and that the EU owes it to itself and to the world trading system to respond to Trump's actions, to show that they are not essentially it's not costless to the United States to act this way. We don't really know where this ends. I mean, in theory, when both sides are going at each other, it creates a strong incentive on both sides to get together, to negotiate, and to come up with a deal. And effectively, that is what happened in the prior 8 years. So Trump's tariffs on aluminum and steel, and the threat of tariffs on cars brought Canada and Mexico to the negotiating table to redo the North American Free Trade Agreement into a new trade agreement that the United States thought was better for it. And it may be that we will discover a year from now that the same script was replayed, that at the end of this process, Canada and Mexico return to the negotiating table, and once again, there's a new trade agreement with changes that the United States prefers. But we're now in a very delicate situation where, miscommunications are widespread, and it comes against a backdrop where I think the rest of the world, look, not only do they question the U.S. commitment to free trade, but it's not just the U.S., but China as well. There's a lot of protectionist resentment against China's business model. So you are seeing, I think, to an extent that's not widely appreciated, a global rise in protectionist barriers among countries, a global retreat from the institutions and the assumptions that drove trade in the post-war period. It's kind of evoking the 1930s, and it's worrisome because I don't think we know where it ends.
Yeah, I do have another follow-up on that, but I think Anavi also has a question regarding tariffs.
Thank you, Professor. So, Mr. Ape, you focused on the idea of reciprocity quite a bit. Why does your country have higher tariffs on U.S. imports than we do on yours? So my question really is Trump's idea of reciprocity in good faith? I mean, countries like Japan and New Zealand actually have lower tariffs on goods like automobiles and some dairy products. So, keeping in line with this idea of reciprocity, is Trump going to lower tariffs on these countries?
So it depends on what you mean by the word reciprocity, right? So, and that's kind of in the mind of the beholder. If you go back to the 1930s, it was a passage of the Reciprocal Trade Act, again sponsored by Cordell Hull, signed and pushed through by FDR, that essentially laid the groundwork for the trade liberalization that preceded the last 80 years. And it was indeed very much conceived on the idea that the only way to get trade barriers down is that two countries would agree to lower barriers on each other. Now, through that process, Trump is quite correct that the U.S. went further than other countries, and our tariffs, on average, are among the lowest in the world, lower than almost any other countries, including some of our closest trading partners. And so his concept is, well, if we raised our tariffs back to the levels of other countries, then that would be number one, fair, or number two, that it would eliminate trade deficits. Now, there's a couple of problems with this logic. The first problem is that if I don't know if any of you are in economics, but in economics, when we look at a trade deficit, we say, well, that is fundamentally the result of a country consuming more than it produces. And that's not necessarily a consequence of tariffs. It can be just a consequence of a country that maybe saves very little or invests a lot. And changing tariffs doesn't necessarily change that imbalance. And so if the United States remains a high-spending, low-saving country, and China, for example, remains a low-spending, high-saving country, altering tariffs in the end will not change trade deficits. So if we go to China, or any other country for that matter, and say, we're going to raise tariffs to your level, and because that's reciprocity, that may not eliminate the trade deficit. And I think that most economists, including the ones who are advising Trump, realize that. And that's one of the reasons why you've seen in their discussion of reciprocity, oh, we're not going to just look at another country's tariff level. We're going to look at all their policies, including, for example, their currency policy. So if you're a country that manipulates your currency to keep it artificially low, which, as you know, means that their exports are artificially cheap in our market, and our exports are artificially expensive in their market, well, we'll consider that as a non-tariff barrier, and we'll include that in our concept of reciprocity. What about value-added taxes? The United States is one of the few, it may be the only major industrialized country that does not have a value-added tax. Now, if you go to a European country, you may know that a value-added tax, or a VAT, is imposed on goods consumed at home, but it is essentially refunded on goods that are exported. There's a good economic reason for that, because the purpose of a value-added tax is to only tax things that are consumed at home, whether that's produced here or imported here. So it's not really discriminating against foreign products. Trump and other people around Trump don't see it that way. They think of VAT discriminate against US exports. So that's going to go into his calculation. Now, you might say that that's not really fair. He's not talking about, he's redefining reciprocity the way he wishes. And I'm, as I myself have written, that given that Trump's fundamental worldview is tariffs are good, deficits are bad, and I will find a way to raise tariffs and get rid of deficits, and I will define reciprocity in a way that gets me to that endpoint. So you might sort of say that in some sense, his definition of reciprocity will be engineered to achieve the result that he wants. But going a level deeper, it is the case that a country like China, even though its tariffs may not be high, has multiple factors in its economy that essentially suppress consumption, boost exports, and are one of the reasons Chinese goods are so cheap and that they have taken so many jobs from Americans. For example, China, taxes its consumers heavily and its rich people not very much. China subsidizes exports in countless ways through things like cheap credit from state-owned banks. China controls its currency so that it doesn't rise as much as it might otherwise do. So if you really wanted to get a truly level playing field, you would come up with some kind of policy mechanism that would address those aspects of the Chinese economy. And none of the trade rules that we've grown up with over the last 80 years, the ones that are in some sense policed by the World Trade Organization, have proven themselves capable of dealing with those distortions. I think the bottom line I'm trying to say here is that it may be the case that Trump is being a little bit, in some sense, picking and choosing the way he defines reciprocity, but it's not off limits to say there are things that other countries do that are not strictly related to tariffs that are unfair trade barriers, and the United States, has a prima facie right to act against those barriers.
I mean, you're certainly, excuse me, sorry.
Thank you. I'm glad that you really broke down this idea of how tariffs are going to be solving a trade deficit problem, because I wanted to shift the conversation to focus on trade deficits and budget deficits. So the American tax code is structured such that we tend to promote more consumption than we do savings. And a lot of economists have been suggesting that we prioritize this shift in incentivization so as to promote the reduction of capital inflows, which will help reduce the trade deficit and the budget deficit. Do you think this is pointing more towards a suggestion that we have to change the very structure and the foundation upon which the American economy is based in order to solve this deficit problem?
Well, you can certainly think about it that way. And in fact, some advocates of tariffs make exactly that case, that the tariff is, in some sense, a consumption tax, but it's one that's finely crafted to only tax imported consumed goods. Now, you'll find free traders and people saying, "Oh, it's terrible. You know, tariffs are taxes, and so on." I like to say that taxes. I wasn't the first person to say this, but it's a useful thing to keep in mind for all economics students. Taxes and economics more generally is not morality play. People tend to sort of like often their attitude towards tariffs or any kind of taxes are often motivated by their priors about whether they think the level of taxation ought to be higher or lower, or trade ought to be freer or less free. And I think that as economic analysts, you want to try and take value judgments out of the question and sort of approach them on a purely analytical base. And it is 100% correct to say that if you have a tax system which emphasizes tariffs more, then you will, at the end of the day, import less, and you might do more of other things more. So, for example, if you took the money that we got from tariffs and used to reduce taxes on profits or capital investment, then you ought to have higher investment and lower imports. But it's a complicated story because there's many other taxes going on here. We know, for example, that lower income families tend to save less, they tend to consume more, and they tend to consume more goods and imported goods. So a tax system that tended to reduce taxes on capital, such as profits, and increase taxes on imports would tend to shift the tax burden to poorer people and away from richer people. That might be a consideration for people who want to rewrite the tax system. And on the question that you raise, Anabi, on whether this would be a fundamental restructure in the US economy, you know the old economist's answer? Well, it depends. Because if you are reducing, you might say, well, we're going to raise, tariff revenue by $300 billion this year. So that all else equal would result in less consumption, especially consumption of imported goods. But if you said at the same time, we're going to reduce income taxes and taxes on tips and tips on overtime and tips on social security benefits and all sorts of other taxes by, say, 500 billion or 600 billion, well, on net, you've actually reduced taxes more than how much you've raised them. And that net reduction will result in a net increase in consumption. And some of that consumption will go towards imported goods. So even though you've redesigned your tax system in a way that's meant to favor domestic production and investment and disfavor imports, the fact that you've actually increased budget deficits and made your country more of a country dependent on borrowing, especially borrowing from abroad, you may end up in the end doing nothing to reduce the trade deficit. You may actually end up making it bigger.
I think I want to ask one more question before we turn it over to questions from the audience, and that is, when we look at what are sort of the policy objectives, as you alluded to, the Biden administration really didn't do much in terms of dismantling the initial Trump tariffs and kept them largely in place with a few exceptions. But it also seems that the policy objective of reshoring, of getting some industries, especially strategic industries like chips and semiconductors, back into the United States, those policy objectives seem to be very similar across the administration. It's just that it seems the Biden administration was more keen on employing industrial policy tools. So in the CHIPS Act, right, and in the Inflation Reduction Act, they built in a lot of subsidies and other incentives for this kind of reshoring. So why is that something that the Trump administration, number two, does not seem to see as a viable way of achieving what seem to be very similar objectives?
That's another great observation, Andreas. So what Trump and Biden had in common was that they both shared this fondness for manufacturing, this belief that the manufacturing sector was a provider of good paying jobs and dignity to people, especially in smaller communities that did not have college degrees, and that it was a mistake to embrace free trade in a way that allowed countries like China to allow jobs and production to migrate from the United States to countries like Mexico and China. So in that sense, they both shared that view. Now, some economists don't share that view. They don't believe that there was anything qualitatively superior about manufacturing. And even if there was something desirable in manufacturing, that didn't necessarily justify the higher costs imposed on consumers. But set that aside for a moment. So you have a common belief between Biden and Trump that manufacturing, bringing some manufacturing back to the United States is a good thing and it's a worthwhile policy objective. But the Trump administration took a different approach in that they thought they wanted a holistic approach. Rather than sort of like impose across-the-board tariffs on manufactured products, they tried to make a judgment on which manufactured products were the ones that the United States should emphasize. And I think it's an important question, again, for any of you who are economics students. Obviously, for the United States to produce everything at home that it consumes would be very difficult. I mean, the very reason we think trade is a good thing is because free exchange, when two parties enter into the free exchange of like goods and services, it makes everybody better off. You know what I mean? Like cities trade with each other, states trade with each other, you trade with your neighbor implicitly because it's not efficient for you to produce everything for yourself at home. And the same is true for countries. So the United States could not, and should not realistically expect to make everything at home that it produces. It ought to ask itself, what are we especially good at producing? And if there's a case for bringing some of that production back to the United States, what are the steps we should do? And Andres, you brought up the CHIPS Act, which was a $50 billion effort to essentially reverse the loss of very high-end, advanced, cutting-edge semiconductor chip fabrication that had once been centered in the United States and had moved increasingly to East Asia, and bring some of it back to the United States. Now, the Trump administration shares the view that it wants chips brought back to the United States, but Trump is also much less discriminating about which manufacturing he wants brought back. He wants it all brought back. There was a line that by J.D. Vance during the campaign, I believe, when he said something like, 1 million knockoff toasters is not worth one American job. Now, it was a good line, and it probably meant more as like a bumper sticker than it was as an analytical statement. But if you think about it, if we were to like make every single American, 165 million American households pay $50 to $100 more for their toasters, so that several thousand people could have jobs here making toasters, I think it's a legitimate question to ask, is that an appropriate policy objective? Are American workers really best suited to using their efforts, and are American capitalists best used to, is the best purpose for American capital and labor to make toasters, or is it to focus on something that where their skill and knowledge and the particular ecosystem of innovation that the United States boasts is better suited to producing? And I think that is probably the distinction you're seeing between the Biden administration approach and the Trump administration approach. I should say that the United States does not have much history of doing industrial policy, and certainly not much history of doing it well. And you could look up all sorts of things from the past, things like supersonic airliners, things about like, synthetic crude oil, things like, fast breeder nuclear reactors. And the landscape is littered with failed industrial policy projects. So there's no guarantee that anything that the past or present administration would have done would have worked out better. But I think the track record of blanket protection for manufacturing is even less encouraging. I mean, look at ships, for example. We've had the Jones Act for over 100 years. That law essentially requires that all freight between U.S. ports, like if you're sending something from Bangor, Maine to Savannah, Georgia, must travel on a ship built in the United States. Well, the United States barely builds any ships right now. We build less than 1% of the world's ships. China builds more than 50%. And effectively, what we've more or less done is raise the cost on everybody who ships between American ports with this law without apparently doing anything to actually sustain a viable, competitive shipbuilding industry. A long way of saying, Andreas, that I think when one starts out from the proposition that some manufacturing is very good for the country and we need to take steps to protect it, that you're only scratching the surface of the policy challenge here. Getting from here to there, where you've actually set in place a variety of policies that protect and nurture a competitive industry without imposing an unbearable burden on the buyers of those products, that is a very long, complicated process. And we really haven't even begun to lay out how we plan to do it.
It's certainly a basic tenet of economics, right? That governments especially are particularly bad at picking winners and losers.
All right, we need to get to some student
We
questions
need to get
now.
to some student questions here. Absolutely.
We want to get as many in as we can. I think, Jack, you're up.
Hey, Mr. Rip, thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Jack, I'm a senior psych major, and I have a question that's along the same lines in manufacturing. So, as we talked about, Trump's aim to reduce foreign manufacturing through high tariffs seems to create inevitably higher costs for small businesses and also has the potential to drive up product prices in multiple industries such as textiles and also technologies. As a result, items will become more expensive and accessible to this upper class. You mentioned you mentioned something that was interesting though, that domestic production does create more jobs in the U.S., but with technological advances, something like producing more toasters can just be automated to something like robots, right? So my question is it fair to say that Trump's agenda includes widening the wealth gap, or is it just a confound of this protectionist plan?
So I guess the answer is that we don't really know. I think that there is definitely an intent on Trump's plan that by putting up protectionist walls around the United States and requiring many of the products that we currently import to be made here in the United States, it will create some jobs in those communities that pay well to those producers. And we do know, for example, that tariffs on steel have protected steel making jobs, and those jobs do pay very well. But as you pointed out in your question, somebody has to pay those higher steel prices. So American steel prices are significantly higher than global steel prices. And that effectively is a tax on all the consumers of steel here in the United States. And exactly what effect that has on the entire economy is a complicated question. Ideally, we would get really good at making steel in the United States, and those jobs would pay well, and buyers of steel wouldn't have to be penalized very much. Maybe though that wouldn't happen. Maybe the American steel industry never learns to become highly competitive and continues to impose those costs. And buyers of steel, they find workarounds. They said, well, we used to buy steel from abroad and then we would turn it into appliances here in the United States. But now it turns out that we can't do that profitably because frankly, the appliances that are made with steel abroad and are assembled abroad are now cheaper. So we're going to go assemble appliances abroad and then bring them into the United States. So it's a very complicated process. As to whether it sort of like addresses the wealth gap, I think we also have to keep magnitudes in mind. There's, the manufacturing workforce, it's only about 10% of the American population now. Now, some of those jobs were lost to foreign competition, and some of them were lost to unfair foreign competition. And I think it's a legitimate public policy goal for this administration and other administrations to take steps to stop that foreign competition from penalizing American workers, even though some American customers will be hurt by it. For example, you might say, China's doing us a huge favor, you know what I mean? They're like sending us all this cheap steel and stuff, and we should be happy about it, even though it's costing us jobs. That might sound good at a theoretical level, but I think to most Americans, it seems fundamentally unfair. But even once you take care of those distortions, you would probably still end up with a much smaller manufacturing workforce than we did 10 or 20 years ago, because as you said in your question, technological advances have reduced the number of workers it takes to make a car and so on. And there are things that, like, for example, if you now have like software that take video games, for example, or music, we now download those from the web. They're not sent on physical copies or disks any longer. So the very nature of production and consumption has changed. And by chasing manufacturing as a concept in and of itself, we may not even be chasing after the things that ultimately consumers want to consume or that make us wealthy. And by interfering, by being sort of somewhat indifferent to the things that we're good at versus the things that we're not good at, we might take away from our ability to really make advances in industries where we're really quite successful. So although I think that there is a lot of value to bringing, say, semiconductor production back to the United States, it is the case that the United States excels at semiconductor design. Companies like Synopsys and Cadence and NVIDIA, these are very valuable, useful companies that pay extremely good wages. And I think that, again, in economics, if you can segregate from your mind whether you're making something a service or a thought or a concept or a physical object that you can drop on your foot, if you separate from your thinking whether the manifestation of the thing you produce matters, a lot of the best and interesting jobs in our society today do not involve manufacturing. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, as your question presumes, simply raising tariffs may sound like a good idea, but introduce all sorts of distortions that in the end may not actually leave us better off. I guess throughout this debate, what I've tried to do in my columns and writing in discussions like this, I've tried not to be in some sense a reflexive free trader who says tariffs are always and everywhere bad, Because, for example, if we believe a country like China isn't just an unfair competitor, but is also a geopolitical adversary, then there actually might be a price American consumers should pay to reduce their dependence on imported goods from China. But I'm nervous about applying that same principle to all products and all trading relationships because of the unintended consequences which you are referring to in your question.
Thank you. Let's go to another student question.
Trying to see who, I don't know who's asked a question recently. I think you have it. Yeah, okay, great.
Hello, my name is Hunter, and I'm a sophomore. Thank you for coming, and I appreciated you placing the current moment historically before speaking on it. I think that's a really important practice, but I wanted to look on a more micro scale, and I don't know how familiar you are with Trump's biography, like before his presidency, but I was wondering how much you think his personality and his reputation, like financially, before like 2015 or 2012, have translated into his economic actions as president in the first and second term. Because us, college students were 18 to 22 years old, so we were 10 to 14 years old when he was first elected president. So we're kind of missing that context of his celebrity presence, of his New York real estate practices. And so I was curious if you think that carried over.
I am not an authority on Trump's pre-presidency life. I'm familiar with some of the popular writings on the topic, and he talks about it and so forth. But certainly those who have covered and written about him will say that the nature, that the dynamics and the power relationships of deal making is central to the way Trump thinks about business relationships and thinks about global economic relationships. So Trump saw himself as a deal maker, and that deals were always about leverage. Who had leverage over the other person? And so he would be a tough negotiator, right? Even once he had signed a deal, for example, for a loan, he would then try to renegotiate or alter the terms of that loan, which is why he was often in fights with his bankers and so forth. He would contract with a supplier to produce, a particular product for one of his casinos. And then he would quarrel with the supplier about whether they had actually, met the terms of the contract, and he wouldn't pay the full amount, arguing that they had not. So this was a person who believed that that there was, in some sense, no such thing as a final deal, that the terms were always negotiable, and that the terms that the outcome of that negotiation was fundamentally dependent on who held the power in that relationship. Since Trump was as a large hotel developer, felt that the prestige and the size of his business gave him leverage, it enabled him to extract terms in deals that others could not, and that should be used. And that, in some sense, is a somewhat different philosophy from some businesses that would essentially try to actually just treat everybody the same way and gain a reputation for being straightforward, no haggle, deal making, and so forth. Now you translate that to the economic deal making realm, and you see very much the same sort of dynamic at play. So going back to the historic origins of the trading rules that the United States was working on before 2016, they were not based on, big countries get good terms and small countries get lousy terms. They were based on everybody plays by the same rules. Those rules are overseen by laws and treaties and organizations like the World Trade Organization. And big countries like the United States and China play by the same rules as small countries like Costa Rica and the Netherlands. Also not the Netherlands, but Costa Rica and, let's say, Morocco or Mexico. But that's not how Trump sees it. Trump basically believes that large countries can and should use their size to impose terms on smaller countries, and smaller countries have no choice in the matter because they depend more on the larger country and its market than they do than vice versa. That is exactly what you see Trump putting into action. So in some sense, one might ask, I think Andreas asked, why did he start a trade war with Canada and Mexico, of all countries, to start with, given that neither is a particularly egregious, violator of trade rules or a geopolitical adversary? Well, I think the answer is because he could, because Mexico and Canada depend heavily on the U.S. market, and that, in Trump's view, gives him leverage over them that he might not have with a China or a European Union or so forth, and so like that. So is that better or worse? Look, once again, one must sort of like not treat all these things as a morality play. You could certainly make the argument that the US underutilized its leverage, its economic leverage with countries to get things that it wanted in the past. Look, if many administrations were frustrated that Mexico, in their view, had not done enough to deal with drug cartels in their own borders or to stop the flow of illegal migrants through the Darien Gap and then up to the southern border. But they were reluctant to use the threat of closing the border and very high tariffs to basically achieve an unrelated policy goal, which was action on drugs and migrants. Trump didn't share that misgiving. He was quite willing to mix and match to essentially use an economic lever to achieve non-economic goals. And in his view, why wouldn't you? You know, as a deal maker, you use all your points of leverage to achieve the goal that you want. So you cannot sort of like basically say on a ipso facto basis that that was wrong. But you do want to sort of step back and ask the larger question. If all countries revert to this process of entering into each transaction as a bespoke contest of wills, as opposed to one that follows, essentially agreed upon rules of the road, in the end, do you invest less in those processes? Does the uncertainty and the capriciousness of the environment mean you invest less, consume less, and you trade less? A world where everybody trades less with each other because they trust each other less is a poorer world. And so I think the question that needs to be answered is whether this transactional, basically might makes right approach to trade, where does that leave us 5 or 10 years from now? Because right now, our close trading allies like a Mexico and a Canada and a Japan and a South Korea and a Europe, they might feel obligated to play by the United States rules because they're so dependent on us. But in the passage of time, they will make different choices. They will say, we do not wish to be as dependent on the United States as we are today because we are less sure of the relationship with the United States, and they will make other arrangements, and they will become less dependent on us. So it's the old rule, right? I mean, if you impose penalties on a country, like tariffs or any other rule for that matter, sanctions policy, for example, if we sanction a country and don't let them use the US dollar or the US banking system unless they stop financing terrorists, they may do one of two things. They may stop financing terrorists just as we wish, or they may stop using the US dollar and the US banking system, at which point we no longer have any leverage. And the same might be true of these robust uses of tariffs. If we eventually succeed in beating down our trading relationships with countries by tariffs, then, well, we may have reduced our imports, but we've also reduced our leverage. And a world that is less integrated is also one where those economic, tools are perhaps a little less powerful. And I'm not sure that's a better world. This is all very preliminary. We don't know where this ends up.
Wow.
There are many people around Trump who say that the end goal here isn't to blow up all those relationships. It's to make them more balanced and more fair, and perhaps end up with an alliance of Western democracies with a shared values on trade and military support, not so dependent on the United States, and a common vision, for example, facing down adversaries like Russia and China. That is one possible outcome here. It's not one that I've seen Trump himself articulate, but it is entirely possible that that could be one place we end up.
Fascinating. And we should certainly get together again in 5 to 10 years. But we have more student questions.
Oh, wow, now we're at the yes, no? You want one? Okay, after.
Hi, I'm Lee Chen. I'm a sophomore majoring in anthropology and economics. So I have a question that basically we can see kind of like two parallels of how Trump is signing deals. One is basically rejecting like free trading deals, and another one is his tendency of signing like mineral deals, especially we see that in like war zone countries like Ukraine and like possibly Congo now. So I'm just wondering like what kind of like does this kind of deal imply as a geopolitical storage of essential minerals, and what kind of like economic future does Trump foresee here by signing these, or like this pattern of signing both, rejecting or signing both kind of deals? Does it conflict with each other, since the rejecting of free trade is basically trying to increase like more manufacturing jobs and everything? So what's the conflict here, and is there a conflict there, or what kind of economic future does Trump foresee here by his way of signing deals with different countries?
Well, first of all, congratulations on your joint major between anthropology and economics. That's a fascinating combination. Maybe you can do some studies into the unusual character of economists and why they're such weird people. If you don't already, you should definitely read the work of Gillian Tett, who's a columnist for a long time for the Financial Times. Her degree is in anthropology as well, so I think you'd have a lot in common with her. Enough about that. I would first of all say that Trump is not the first person to bring other types of economic relationships into the discussion about what our relationships should be with other people. One of the most interesting and important dynamics we've seen in the last 5 or 6 years is a realization that economic dependencies aren't just about trade. They are often about, well, if you are the only supplier of, say, a rare mineral, or a particular microchip, or personal protective equipment for an epidemic, that creates a degree of economic dependency that's maybe not healthy in the long run. You don't really want to depend on only one country for those things, especially if that country may not be friendly towards you, as China often is not. So under the Biden administration, and in fact, Europe has done this as well, you saw proliferate things like critical minerals deals and things like export controls. In other words, economic relationships that really weren't about trade at all. They were about, we will actually provide preferential terms for financing. We will open up the spigot for example, like bank lending or World Bank or international loans to you in Africa or you in South America to develop your critical minerals, because we think it would be helpful for the United States to have you as a supplier of critical minerals to us instead of China. And similarly, starting in the late days of the Trump administration and continued by the Biden administration, there were efforts to essentially block the sale of certain technologies to China, like in semiconductor design and very advanced software and artificial intelligence, out of a view that while that might be a good thing for the Americans who produce those technologies, it is a bad thing for the security of the country and its allies as a whole. And the United States pressured its allies like Japan and the Netherlands, who also supplied that technology, to join us. So that background is meant to show you that the idea that our economic relationships are multidimensional or no longer just about trade did not begin with Trump. But you're absolutely right that Trump is maybe unique in that he also sees added value in extracting special deals, for example, for the United States to have the right to certain minerals. You'll remember that after the first Gulf War, when the United States went into the Middle East to eject Iraq from Kuwait, Trump, then a private citizen, says we should have taken the oil. He said that if we're going to spend all this money to protect Saudi Arabia and liberate Kuwait, we should take oil in return. He said that in return for all the money we gave to Ukraine, we should have the right to Ukrainian minerals and so forth. And I think this reflects, going back to the last question, or a little bit of Trump's transactional thinking, which is also true of the development career, that you don't do favors for other countries unless you get something in return that is proportionate to the particular leverage or the dependency of that country on the United States. There's no charity, there's no sort of longer term investment in the rules-based international order. It's, let's get the dollars that we can out of it. But I think it's not that well formed at the moment, and it's something that I hope to write about more in the future. Exactly what is it worth it to the United States to have the right to extract minerals in Ukraine or Congo? I mean, as it turns out, there is no shortage of, let's say, copper. Now, copper is a very important mineral, right? It's important to all sorts of electrical processes and to electrical vehicles and wiring and so forth. So essentially, the economy can't work without copper. And countries like, Chile and other countries have a lot of copper. And so maybe we should be signing deals to get their copper. But here's the deal. The United States has a crap ton of copper. Okay, we are not short of copper. What we are short of is copper refineries. And that's because nobody wants to invest the money to build a refinery here, given the cost of labor, the cost of capital, and all the environmental regulations that are involved. And frankly, it's expensive to get copper out of other countries as well. So merely having the right to extract minerals from some of these countries is not that valuable. So in some sense, I think that the economist says, establish reasonable rules of the road and allow other countries to transact with each other on a commercial basis the way two companies or two individuals would. And they will enter into a deal, whether it's to trade a product or to mine for some minerals or to like produce software or something like that, if it's advantageous to both sides. And at that point, it's kind of irrelevant whether, the United States has the upper hand or Congo has the upper hand, and we sign a deal or we don't sign a deal. The minerals will be extracted or the products will be traded if both sides benefit from the deal. As an economist, I tend to be biased towards thinking that those sorts of unconditional, unconstrained exchanges of willing voluntary exchanges lead to both sides to be better off. But we seem to be heading in a direction where a lot more international transactions are in fact not of that voluntary free exchange variety, but more of a state-driven, coercive or structured variety. And I can see why geopolitically that might be interesting or appealing, but I don't think in the end it leaves the world better off. But as I've said a number of times tonight, this is early in the process, and we don't know how it ends.
I'm aware that we are running a little bit short of time, so I think Navi has a couple more things, perhaps.
Just last two questions, Mr. Ip. The first one being, if there's any advice you would like to give to us as young investors, what would it be?
As young investors? I don't know.
A generation that's about one or two generations behind us.
What can I say that's even remotely useful or different from anything you can get from the newspaper or from your Fidelity account advisor or something like that? Let me say a few things. When I was your age, I was a very emotional investor, and if the market went down a lot, I would sell. If it went up a lot, I would buy. And I had a lot of trouble sort of thinking about the long term. Now that I'm older, I realize that there are so many things I should have done back then. Among them, I should have had more equities, and I should have looked at the market a heck of a lot less. In fact, I sometimes feel that people like me who work on a daily basis in the markets are at a disadvantage because we have no choice except to look at the market and allow our emotions to be flung back and forth by it. I will tell you, I started my job not covering the economy. My first job at the Wall Street Journal was not as an economics person, it was as a markets person. And I think within weeks of starting my job in the 90s, we had the Asian financial crisis, and we had stock market crash after stock market crash. And I would walk into the office that day, and the screen with all the stock market quotes, it was all red, everything was down. And I knew it was just going to be a bad day and I was going to be there late. If I had been as an investor and I just said, screw it, and just threw all my money in the market and just went away and ordered a hamburger or did a crossword puzzle, I'd be so much richer now. Okay, now, I am not in the business of giving investment advice, and do not take anything I've just said as investment advice or anything that you should be doing with your investments. I thought that actually you were going to ask me a different question. Which was about what you should do with your career. So unless somebody else wants to ask me that question, I'll go ahead and answer it now.
And to end with, Mr. Ip, I should be asking Mr. Professor Walkirch, but I'll be asking you instead. If you were a professor who had to grade President Trump's administration's macroeconomic policies, what grade would you give them?
I'm absolutely not going to do that. Because, first of all, it is March of 2025, which is the equivalent of the second week of the semester. Second of all, there's no answer key. You know what I mean? Policymaking is hard. There are no clear answers. And there's endogeneity involved. By endogeneity, what I mean is that the questions, the way you answer a particular question sometimes changes the question itself. And that the question you end up answering is not the question you started with. And that's a little bit, I will say that over my career, I've changed my mind a lot. There were things that I started with, assumptions that I had, that I changed my mind about because I discovered I didn't know as much as I thought I did. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing, as they say. But I studied economics in college. I graduated with a degree. I thought I was good at economics. I didn't know anything. I didn't know nearly as much about economics when I graduated university than when I'd actually finished writing about it after many years' time. I'll tell you that I probably started covering the Trump administration in its first term with my priors being somewhat pro-free trade. But I learned from people like Robert Lighthizer that some of my priors were wrong. And that, for example, the notion that just because China had joined the World Trade Organization and ostensibly played by the rules, that it was therefore a free trader and we were all on the same playing field. I learned by listening to people who didn't share my priors that I was probably wrong. And so I got a more nuanced view on that. All of us, I think, owe it to ourselves, and this goes to the question of emotion in markets, to try and disentangle. We live in a world, I think, one of the ways the world has changed in the 20 or 30 years I've been a journalist is that the quantity of information has grown by orders of magnitude, and the speed with which that information comes to us as basically the latency has collapsed, so that new information comes at you with a speed and a volume that is utterly unlike anything when I started with. I mean, when I started, you would get economic data on a fax machine. You probably don't even know what a fax machine is. And it would come hours after the number was released. And you sat around for 6 hours trying to decide what it meant before you decided to write it up. That information comes at you in a minute. You know, the markets are responding. And on Twitter, there's already 500 opinions about that. And the same goes true for any policy decision made by Trump or President Biden before him. And it tests us because we don't really know truly what the consequences are in the first moment, right? I mean, sometimes it takes time to sort of like realize those things. And there's a temptation and natural human instinct to respond emotionally or to work from your priors. And so what I try to do, at least in my job, because I have the luxury as a columnist that I don't have to weigh in that instant on everything. And I can take a few days or even a week to think about it and let it marinate and try and come up with a deeper thought about it. So I try to separate my emotions from it. I always try to look at every issue. I always try to actually read the arguments that everybody's making in their own favor. It's kind of a legal approach, you know, allow both sides of the argument to come into the court of public opinion, advance the best case they have for them, and then weigh those things. Try not to let my priors or my prejudices or the emotional arguments around me to drive me towards that decision. And one of the things, you know, I'll give you one bit of advice that I find very useful is to actually, the temptation is because there are so many channels of interpretation around us, whether it's news like the Wall Street Journal, which I still continue to believe is the gold standard of fair, accurate, and contextual reporting, all the way down to like, you know, blogs, Substacks, tweets, Instagrams, and all sorts of things, is that try whenever possible to go to the source, to figure out what was originally said. Don't allow somebody else to interpret events for you. Look at the numbers if you can. You know what I mean? Don't just go by what was said. Like, there's a famous line by, I think it was Nixon, who said, "We're all Keynesians now." And people love to use that line, you know. But actually what he said is, but in some sense, where none of us are Keynesians. So if you actually go back to the original, the origins of a lot of the things that we take for granted, you discover the arguments in there are so much richer and interesting than we took them for granted. There's so many times when we look at history and say, how could they have been so stupid? How many times have you heard that, like, you know, the Great Depression was caused by the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act or something like that? And we now know it was probably caused by, you know, adherence to the gold standard and stuff like that. The world is always changing. There are incredible forces out there. Be curious. Go to the source. Ask the original. Interrogate your priors. Interrogate everything around you. Don't let anybody think for you. Always, always be exploring. Be curious. Ask questions. Be skeptical, but don't be cynical.
This is great advice that you're giving here, and there would be a lot more to talk about, of course. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So I want to thank everybody who was here tonight. I want to thank Alison BA for organizing this evening and for generally organizing this great series of In the News. All of you for listening, for the great questions, my co-moderator for her questions, and of course, special thanks to you, Greg, for giving us a lot to think about, but also a lot of insights from your very special perspective there in Washington. And I wish we had more time to do more things, but for now, this is it. And again, thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.